That's great. Well, thanks so much for having me here today to talk to you about a subject that I find quite fascinating. As the title suggests, today I'll be talking about a journal. The journal was written by this fellow. Get his image up on the screen. This is Henry Edward Baynes. Henry was a British Army officer serving in the Royal Artillery. He was stationed in Toronto in the year 1863. Henry was a yachtsman, an artist, a writer, and a poet. He wrote this journal, A Cruise of the Breeze. But let me start in 1870. At the age of 22, this young Victorian woman was about to embark on an extraordinary adventure. This is Henry's little sister, Isabel. Isabel Baynes moved unaccompanied from Britain to Canada in 1870. Sadly, her mother had just passed away, and Isabel's taking all of her possessions from her London home in Brixton to live with her widowed aunt in North America. Isabel's father, Philip Oddie Edgerton Baynes, had died many years earlier when Isabel was just 8 years old. Here's a tiny portion of the family tree, and you can see here where Isabel and Henry fit in. There was also a middle child there, Elizabeth. Now, when Isabel emigrated from Britain, she brought Henry's journal along with her, and she also brought some personal mementos and dozens of Henry's beautiful watercolor paintings. So, who was this talented artist and writer, Henry Edward Baynes? Well, let's jump back a few decades, back to 1840. In 1840, Queen Victoria is on the throne. At 21 years old, she's been queen for 3 years. And her empire, the British Empire, is rapidly growing, largely due to the world's largest navy and the world's most active army. 1840 is the year that Henry Baynes was born. He was born in the town of Shrewsbury in Shropshire, England, and Shropshire is just a tiny landlocked county on the Welsh border. Henry's father, Edgerton Baynes, was a surgeon. He had served for several years in the Indian Army. And Henry's mother, Mary Rice, was from a family that included several naval officers and army officers, as well as some prominent artists. Mary herself was an accomplished watercolorist. Now, at a young age, Henry showed promise as an artist. This self-portrait is attributed to him. His artistic ability was likely encouraged by his mother and her uncle, who was a well-known portrait artist in Britain. However, growing up in an upwardly mobile, middle-class English family, Henry would be expected to get an education and then choose an appropriate profession, either as a Church of England minister, like his grandfather, James Johnson Baynes, or as a medical professional, like his father, or as an officer in the British Army. Well, Henry chose to embark on a military career. He was fascinated by the technical aspects of the army, especially the artillery and the military engineers. As a result of this interest in the military, Henry gained admittance to the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, which is just at the time, a suburb of London, England. And that's where all the officers who were destined for the Royal Engineers or the Royal Artillery were trained. They were trained in how to build things and how to blow them up. Well, cadets at the Royal Military Academy were given basic instruction, not only in soldiering, but in mathematics, chemistry, and French, also surveying, plan drawing, and landscape painting. Well, Henry quickly passed from the theoretical class at the academy to the practical class, and in 1859 he graduated and was granted a commission as a lieutenant in the British Army. Henry was immediately posted to No. 5 Battery, 10th Garrison Brigade, Royal Regiment of Artillery, which was then stationed on the island of Alderney in the English Channel. Here's a photograph of Henry. He's all kitted out there with his new uniform, has his nice overcoat, his brand new sword. All of this was purchased, by the way, out of his own pocket. On the island of Alderney, where Henry was first posted, was it really a special place for Henry? He lived here when he was a child. Located just off the coast of France. His sister was born here. He had been there and had actually grown up there as a child. His sister, Isabel, was born there. You can get beyond this screen now. There, and there's one of the forts, and many, many forts on the island of Alderney. One of them is where Henry was stationed, and where just his job on the island was really to command his section and maintaining the artillery and going through the artillery drills. Also, when he was on the Channel Islands, that Henry probably developed his interest in sailing, because he lived in 3 different posts along the English Channel, first on Alderney, then later he moved to Guernsey, and then to Portsmouth across the channel on the main island. Significantly, though, it was on Guernsey in 1860 that the Royal Guernsey Yacht Club was officially formed. So we think it was here that Henry got his first taste of yachting. So that brings us to 1861. Now, Henry Baines is now stationed in Portsmouth. But in all the far-flung corners of the British Empire, many of Henry's fellow soldiers have been fighting in places like New Zealand and India and China. It's been a year and a half since Henry received his officer's commission. And since that time, the 10th Artillery Brigade has really been doing nothing but boring peacetime garrison duty around the British Isles. Well, all of that was soon to change. "4,000 miles away, across the Atlantic Ocean, civil war had broken out in the United States. 11 southern states had seceded from the Union. They formed the Confederate States of America, and they took up arms against the northern states. Now, as a result of that, it wasn't long before the once friendly relationship between the US and Britain quickly turned to animosity over many issues that developed during the first few months of the American Civil War. One satirical British newspaper, Punch, expressed the two countries' differing views in this way. Newspapers really on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean were filled with speculation about war between Great Britain and the US. And Canada was caught in the middle. One Canadian newspaper, the Toronto Globe, expressed this opinion in November 1861. War between Britain and the United States would be the greatest crime ever committed against Christianity and civilization. It's not to be thought of for a moment. Nobody wants to fight on this frontier, but if both sides go to building forts, enrolling volunteers, and storing up arms, a conviction will gradually arise that they are enemies, and then a small spark may kindle a great flame. Well, the spark that kindled that great flame came on November 7th, 1861, when the US warship San Jacinto fired upon the British Royal Mail steamship Trent in international waters. A detachment of US Marines boarded the Trent and seized 4 Southern agents. And that included the Confederate diplomats James Mason and John Slidell. This Trent affair outraged the British government and much of the British populace. Never mind that the steamship Trent was carrying Confederate diplomats on board. Never mind that the captain of the USS San Jacinto was not acting under orders from Washington. And never mind that Britain's Royal Navy had done exactly the same thing 50 years earlier, precipitating the War of 1812. Despite all that, the British government made immediate plans to ship 12,000 troops across the Atlantic Ocean to its Canadian colony, along with tons of arms, ammunition, and other war materiel. This would be the vanguard of a much larger force designed to wage war against the United States. Among these soldiers leaving Britain in December 1861 were 117 officers and men of Number 5 Battery, 10th Brigade, Royal Artillery, including Lieutenant Henry Edward Baynes. So Baynes and his battery boarded the steamship Asia. Asia left Liverpool. 9.5 days later, after battling several winter storms, you remember this is December, they finally arrived in Halifax. But then after another 2 days at sea, traveling to St. John, New Brunswick, then a 10-day trek across snowy New Brunswick by sleigh, then another 3 days by train, they finally made it to their destination. On March 5th, 1862, Henry and his battery arrived in Toronto. So this is how Henry Baynes, along with 12,000 other British soldiers, ended up in Canada. And this is what Toronto would have looked like in the spring of 1862. Well, when these British soldiers went to Canada, they were expecting a fight, or at the very least, they were expecting to defend Canada from the US. But there would be no war. By December 31st, 1861, President Lincoln had already decided that the US had more urgent matters to focus on, namely the rebellious Confederate states to the south. So he decided to concede to the British demands and release the 4 Confederates that had been taken from the steamship Trent. Nevertheless, the British government decided to proceed with the troop deployment, and the result was that Lieutenant Baynes and many of the hundreds of other British Army officers now in Canada had very few military duties to occupy their time. And knowing that peacetime garrison duty in a foreign station could be very tedious, the Army officers who were for the most part men of means, found lots of leisure pastimes to occupy themselves. There were balls and parties and amateur theatricals. There were sporting activities such as hunting and shooting, cricket and soccer, and even in the winter, there was lots to do. There was ice boating, ice skating, and sleigh riding. When he wasn't occupied with his infrequent military duties, Henry would visit relatives in Toronto. Coincidentally, his father's older brother, Thomas Baines, lived with his wife and children. Their house was a very short carriage ride from the officers' barracks at the new fort where Henry lived in Toronto. If any of you have been to the Canadian National Exhibition, this building, the new fort barracks, is still standing. Well, before arriving in Toronto, Henry likely had never met his uncle Thomas. Thomas Baines had lived in Canada for more than 30 years and had come here as a land commissioner in charge of collecting rents on the old Upper Canada clergy reserves. Unfortunately, though, Thomas and several other land commissioners got into the habit of not remitting the money collected. And eventually, many of the land agents were charged with embezzling government funds. Well, Thomas got lucky. He was allowed to resign his post after paying the money back instead of going to jail. Well, Thomas Baines was married twice, first to Catherine Wilcox, with whom he had 5 children, and then to Catherine Banks, with whom he had 6 children. The descendants of some of these children still live in Toronto today. But let's get back to Henry. When he wasn't performing his military duties or attending social functions in Toronto, Henry was also known for pursuing his 2 passions, art and sailing. Henry would sometimes go on long painting excursions. Here are 3 of his watercolors from July 1863. This one is of Tews Falls, just outside of Hamilton. Here's Henry's view of Port Dalhousie, which is part of St. Catharines. And here's one view that he did of the American Falls at Niagara Falls. Well, as for yachting, well, this was a relatively new sport in North America, and it became popular with many British military officers. In Toronto, many members of the garrison, including Henry, joined the local yacht club. In fact, it was the only organized yacht club on the Great Lakes at that time, the Royal Canadian Yacht Club. Now, when Henry was a member there, this was the clubhouse, the dilapidated steamer called the Provincial, seen here a few years later, stuck in the ice of Toronto Bay. It was during the summer of 1863 that Henry, along with a number of friends from the RCYC, went on a pleasure cruise around Lake Ontario aboard the yacht called the Breeze. During the cruise, Henry kept a journal, which he illustrated in a manuscript that he called A Month's Sleeve for the Cruise of the Breeze. Well, I've now written a book about Henry Edward Baines based on his manuscript, and it includes all of the journal's original paintings and drawings. Well, for any of you who might be interested in boats and the technical details, let me give you a few details about the Breeze. She was a gaff-rigged topsail cutter, designed in Canada, but built in Britain. It was called a 17-ton first-class yacht. She would have been about 40 feet length on deck with a beam of about 10 feet. And that's pretty much how her sails would have been arranged. The crew and the passengers on the Breeze that summer consisted of Henry Baines and two other artillery officers, Lieutenant Henry Harvey and Assistant Surgeon Samuel Woodfull. Also, there was a Toronto law student, Fred Duggan. There were also two other serving officers. Oh yeah, that's the pilot, a guy named Burrell. There were two other Army officers, Captain Morrison of the military transport and Captain Clarkson of the 30th Regiment. That's Captain Clarkson on the end there. And then there's Captain Clarkson's servant, who was brought on board to do all the cooking, and another retired Army officer named Captain Hancock. But most importantly, there was the captain of the yacht, also the yacht's owner, Dr. Edward Mulberry Hodder. He was Commodore of the Royal Canadian Yacht Club, and he brought along his 11-year-old son, whose nickname was Mellows. Not only was Dr. Hodder remembered for being a prominent Toronto surgeon, a founding member of the Royal Canadian Yacht Club, and the club's Commodore for more than 20 years, he also was the author of this cruising guide for the lake, the first cruising guide ever produced for Lake Ontario, The Harbors and Ports of Lake Ontario, published in 1857. Now, this was long before cruising guides, which had been used until recently by sailors on the lake. And Hodder's cruising guide included not only lots of descriptive material, but also plans like this of every harbor of any importance around the lake. Now, of the 11 passengers and crew that started the cruise in August 1863, 4 of them left the ship at Coburg, so only 7 completed the voyage. This is Henry's hand-drawn map showing the track of the Breeze and all of the ports and towns that he and his companions visited that August. Henry's observations of the places he visited and the people he met really provide us with a fascinating perspective on life in North America in the mid-19th century. So, 10:15 a.m., Monday, August 3rd, 1863, the Breeze and her crew set out on their adventure. In the words of Henry Baines, a summer cruise, a careless sail that gives material for a careless tale. Now they had every indication of a pleasant overnight sail to their first destination, Coburg. They had planned their arrival at Coburg just in time for the annual town regatta. En route to Coburg, Henry composed a poem. The boat was still, the wind was light, the sky all clear above it, the water calm and gleaming bright, but whiskey would improve it. Just half the sun above the land, a broad red shining band, and all around red windless heaven, this at 6:45. The red light quickly fades away, and in the west gives place to gray. The night is fine, not wind enough to keep the flapping sails distended, save now and then a transient puff. And so our first day out is ended. The Breezers would spend the next 5 days in and around Coburg, visiting local sites, watching the annual regatta, attending the regatta ball, and commenting on various local characters. From Coburg, the Breeze sailed to Presqu'île. On the 9th of August, they say goodbye to Coburg and did some fishing at Presqu'île. And from Presqu'île, they sailed into Wellers Bay over to Consicon. Then from here, their next destination was Wapoos Island on the far side of the east side of Prince Edward County. Now, this was really the most perilous part of their voyage, really sailing around the dangerous Prince Edward Peninsula. Today, many sailors sailing in Lake Ontario would never even consider sailing this route. Instead, they would choose to go through the Murray Canal and the Bay of Quinte. But in 1863, this wasn't an option. The Murray Canal didn't exist. It wasn't officially opened until 1890. Well, during that century, until the Murray Canal opened, there is documentary evidence that shows that at least 17 ships and 55 lives were lost because this canal was not built. The canal had been planned as early as the 1790s, and it took almost a century for the government to build it. Well, much of Lake Ontario is quite deep and it's easily navigable by sailing ships and steamships. The northeastern quadrant of the lake, from Presqu'île Point near Brighton over to Kingston, really presents some numerous hazards to mariners. For most of the 19th century, ship captains sailing to Kingston and the entrance to the St. Lawrence River had to navigate all the way around Prince Edward County. And since there were no sheltered harbors in that area, they were forced to sail much of the distance, knowing that there would be no harbors of refuge if the storm came up. The problem here is that there are a number of geographical, geological, hydrographical, and meteorological factors. They all converge in this quadrant of the lake to compound the dangers presented by the protruding Prince Edward Peninsula. One of those is that line of shoals and rocky islands that reaches right across Prince Edward, right across the lake from Prince Edward County to New York State. That's called the Duckgaloo Ridge. And it's an area where the lake suddenly gets shallower and narrower, and it caused so many shipwrecks and ship sinkings in the 19th century that this area became known as the graveyard of Lake Ontario. Now, it's for that reason that a series of lighthouses was built all the way around Prince Edward County. And by 1863, there were 5 major lake lights and a number of smaller lights that were located on the Canadian shores of these dangerous waters. Now, these essential aids to navigation helped to reduce the loss of life and loss of ships until the Murray Canal was opened in 1890. By the beginning of World War I, a total of 45 lighthouses and light towers had been built in this area. And for anyone who might be interested in learning more about these lighthouses, I've written a book about them called For Want of a Lighthouse. It's available online. I have a couple of copies here if anyone's interested. Let's get back to the Breeze for our presentation. So right now the Breeze is leaving Wellers Bay. It's a Tuesday morning. She's bound for Wapoos Island on the east side of Prince Edward County. And this is what Henry writes in his journal. We were fairly in the lake by 10:30, then commenced a long beat of 12 miles dead to windward with a nice little sea running straight before the wind. Our object was to get between the rocky group known as the Scotch Bonnet and Nicholas Island, so that we might bear away round Prince Edward and get into South Bay on its eastern coast by night. It would have been at this time that Henry made this quick sketch of the approach to Scotch Bonnet Island. That's where a lighthouse had been constructed just a few years earlier. By 5 p.m., the breezers were just off of Point Peter. So they were making good time. And again, quoting from Henry's journal, then all at once, the sky clouded over to the southwest. It soon became evident that a pretty heavy squall was coming up. We took in the jib and double reefed the mainsail. One squall passed astern of us toward the northeast. After a very short consultation, the mainsail was lowered. Then the wind fell nearly calm. Then out of the southwest burst 3 flashes of lightning, flooding the whole sky with intense brilliancy. The squall burst over us, a sudden violent gust of wind, then steady, hard blow and thick streaming rain. We drove through the water under our foresail sheeted down close at a grand pace. The first fury of the squall was now spent, but it still blew a gale and the sea grew heavier. All the sky was black, except one very beautiful break to the westward, a clear space amongst the clouds, orange golden over the blue trees of Prince Edward. The sun set and darkness came on apace. We sighted the Duck's Light. Then our course was altered and it became necessary to set the mainsail. We close reefed it. Once or twice, big schooners appeared suddenly out of the darkness. One showed no light, but just stood across our bows and vanished to the northward. Wet, tired, and sick, I turned in and slept till 2:30. Well, that gale of August 11th, 1863, was one of the fiercest on the Great Lakes that year. Not only did it blow the breeze past Wapoos Island all the way to Kingston, but it did damage throughout the lakes, including the loss of $1 million worth of wheat being carried aboard several ships bound for Buffalo, New York. The breeze arrived in Kingston just before dawn, where they anchored offshore and had an early morning snack: ham, biscuits, and whiskey. This is a view that Henry painted while he was on board the breeze, just as they approached Kingston that morning. So they spent the next 3 days in Kingston. They were sailing, visiting friends, and generally recovering from the storm. On the morning of Saturday, August 15th, the breezers decided that Kingston was, quote unquote, played out. While the cruise was certainly not over, there were still many more adventures ahead. From Kingston, the breeze sailed to Wapoos, where Henry painted this watercolor of Cape Vesey. And in his journal, Henry describes the scenery and people he encountered in Prince Edward County during the 3 days that they were exploring the area. Over the course of the following 10 days, the breezers would be sailing in American waters. Well, today, this would be a relatively uneventful part of any cruise around Lake Ontario. However, in 1863, at this stage of the cruise, there were still 3 officers of Her Britannic Majesty's Army on board the yacht. And those 3 officers had been sent to British North America just 18 months earlier in anticipation of a war with the United States. Well, as we know, the war between the US and Britain didn't happen, but diplomatic relations between the 2 countries remained strained until after the end of the American Civil War. Now, in August of 1863, the United States of America was still in the middle of a fight to remain united. The Confederate Army had early victories at Fort Sumter and Bull Run in 1861. Those were followed by a number of horrifically bloody battles, places like Shiloh, Antietam, Chancellorsville, and many others. Just a month earlier, in July 1863, the Confederate Army had pushed as far north as Pennsylvania. The Confederate defeat there at Gettysburg was really just the beginning of the end for the Confederate Army. By the spring of 1865, the Southern rebels would be defeated and the Civil War would be over. But in August of 1863, Lake Ontario seemed a long way from the Civil War. So the Breeze sailed into her first American port, Sackett's Harbor. Today, Sackett's Harbor is a lovely town, has beautiful houses, nice restaurants, lovely boutiques, and a really good marina. Back in 1863, however, it was very different. Sackett's Harbor had been a lively market town in upstate New York, but the economic effects of the Civil War stripped the town of most of its men and devastated the whole area commercially. Really wouldn't be until the 1970s that Sackett's Harbor started to be revitalized. Henry Baines had a very poor first impression of the town. We found ourselves anchored nearly in the center of a wretched little harbor lined with rotten quays and rotting vessels. A fearfully dreary place it seemed to be. Well, in 1863, the only remarkable thing about Sackett's Harbor was this: the Big Ship House. The Big Ship House had been built as a protective cover for a relic of the War of 1812. The 120-gun battleship USS New Orleans, which had been built to counter the British ship built at Kingston, the HMS St. Lawrence. However, the New Orleans had never been finished, so they just mothballed it with the expectation that there would be another naval war at some time in the future. Well, in spite of his initial comments, Henry did acknowledge the reason for the deserted condition of Sackett's Harbor. He said, "The prevailing desolation of the town is attributable to the fact of the county in which it is situated having sent 2,500 men to the war already." A part of that number was made up of these fellows: the 35th New York Infantry, also called the Jefferson County Regiment. And as Henry Baines was writing those words, another 700 men were being recruited. The 20th Regiment, New York Volunteer Cavalry, was being raised at Sackett's Harbor. The Breezers, including Henry and his fellow officers, wandered over to the regiment's headquarters at Madison Barracks, and the sentry there gladly let them in. After a day and a half at Sackett's Harbor, the Breezers were happy to leave. Henry expressed his feelings in another poem. "At last, O Sacketts, fare you well. At last, we burst the spell. that chained us in thy rotting port, between thy rotten ship and port. The pride of thy town is utterly dead. There's nothing to do there but turn into bed. Farewell, Sackett's Harbor, thou art thoroughly played out. The cruise, however, continued on for another 8 days, with the breezers calling at Oswego, Sodus Point, Charlotte, and Rochester. All the while, Henry was still recounting more stories in his journal, encounters with American soldiers, watching minstrel shows, seeing the sights, and painting many, many more watercolors. I really don't have time today to describe all of Henry's adventures, but they are all contained in my book, along with many more watercolors and pen and ink sketches that Henry did on the cruise. So on Thursday, August 27th, after a cruise of 25 days, the Breeze arrived back in Toronto. But this is not the end of the story. In Toronto, Lieutenant Baines and his fellow officers went back to their usual routine of military duties, much as they were, and social outings. Here's Henry living the difficult life in Toronto, all the social outings, parties. And Henry remained an active member of the Royal Canadian Yacht Club. In 1865, even, he was elected as the club's fleet's captain. However, he was unable to take an active role in club activities because No. 5 Battery was soon posted away to Quebec City. Here we are in 1865. Lieutenant Baines and the other officers and men of No. 5 Battery boarded this ship, the steamer Magnet, on the afternoon of May 23rd, 1865, and they began a 3-day journey down Lake Ontario and along the St. Lawrence River to Quebec City. Henry had to say goodbye to many of the friends and family that he had met over the previous 3 years, and people he would never see again. As Henry sailed along the shores of Lake Ontario, he wrote another poem. Far back, the low smoke trailing lies, back streams the braid white foam, and backward still I strain my eyes towards our 3 years home. No more for me the breeze may blow from sky so clear or lake so blue. Perchance I ne'er again shall know a life so calm with friends so true. But still, wherever my fate may lead, by Indian palms or dear home shore, no quiet dreams at evenfall. Old forms will rise, old voices call. The past will claim my heart and awe. The dear old times be mine once more. Quebec, however, would offer Henry the opportunity to continue painting and to refine his art, and he painted more than 50 watercolors depicting scenes in and around Quebec City. Sadly, however, Henry would never see the Indian palms of his poem. He would never see his dear home shore again. He would never see his family again. This is one of the last watercolors that Henry Edward Baines painted before his death in 1866. This depicts a fire that occurred on the evening of May 9th, 1866, not far from the church of Notre-Dame de Jacques-Cartier in the suburb of Saint-Roch, just a kilometer from the Royal Artillery Barracks in Quebec City. Just 5 months later, in the early morning hours of Sunday, October 14th, another fire started in the exact same neighborhood. Soon it was raging out of control through the crowded streets of the working class suburb, where hundreds of wooden shops and houses were huddled very closely together along the St. Charles River. The fire brigade had been called out, but they were being overwhelmed by the extent of the fire, which was being whipped up by high winds. At 6 a.m., all of the military units stationed at Quebec City were called out to help put out the fire. The barracks of the Royal Artillery, shown here, is where the 10th Brigade was staying. They were closest to the fire, so they were the first on scene. By then, it was useless trying to douse the flames because there was an inadequate water supply. So the soldiers set about tearing down wooden buildings and blowing up others to create a fire break. This was in an attempt to starve the fire of fuel. The fire soon approached the General Hospital convent, where many patients still lay in their beds and where hundreds of terrified residents had sought refuge from the fire. Lieutenant Baines and his gunners were hurriedly sent to create a fire break in front of the hospital. They set 2 large kegs of gunpowder inside a nearby brick building and laid a long trail of powder as a fuse. Henry ordered his men out of the building while he lit the fuse. Before he could reach safety behind the hospital walls, the gunpowder exploded, sending him and his sergeant flying 30 feet through the air. The fire was stopped, but Henry was buried in the rubble and severely injured. His men quickly carried him and his sergeant into the hospital, where the nurses, the Sisters of St. Augustine, cared for them. Henry was attended by 3 doctors, and after a few days, although still in critical condition, he was awake, talking, and showing signs of improvement. The General Hospital had been saved. When the fire had finally been put out, but much of Quebec suburb of Saint-Roch and Saint-Sauveur were utterly devastated. 6 people had died, and many, including a dozen military men, had been injured. 1,200 buildings had been destroyed, and 20,000 people were left homeless. The military set up a temporary tent city west of the burned area, and the mayor of Quebec City appealed to the city's bakers to work around the clock to supply bread to the homeless. After 10 days in hospital, Henry was able to sit up in bed, and he received several visitors, including his battery commander, Major Leslie, and Mrs. McCrae, the wife of the brigade commander. Henry wrote a letter to his mother, but the next day, this talented young man was dead. He had contracted tetanus, and he died on October 27, 1866. Henry Edward Baines was 26 years old. In recognition of the soldiers' heroism and sacrifice, the mayor of Quebec City insisted that the garrison commandant agree to give Lieutenant Baines a public funeral with full military honors. On October 31st, 1866, the huge funeral procession wound its way through the narrow streets of Quebec City. Thousands of people lined the route. Church bells tolled for hours. Henry Edward Baines was buried in Quebec's Mount Herman Cemetery, and this monument was erected over his grave. Henry's personal possessions, including his paintings and his journal, were sent back to his mother in England. Many of his fellow artillery officers wrote letters of condolence to Mary Baines and her daughters, who were then living in London. To Mary Baines, the Sisters of St. Augustine, who had nursed Henry in his final days, wrote this letter. It was beneath our roof that Lieutenant Baines breathed his last sigh. Oh, the pang that went through every heart when the sad news became known. As for the sisterhood of this community, we have more reason than all others to deplore the melancholy fate of your son. Was it not while endeavoring to save our monastery from impending destruction that he incurred the fatal accident? One more object we have to offer, dear madam. It is a lock of your dear son's hair. The locket in which it is enclosed contains also his likeness, the best we could procure. We earnestly request that you kindly accept this slight token of our loving and heartfelt sympathy. This locket was one of the possessions that Isabel Baines brought with her when she came to live in Canada 4 years later. It was also at that time that Isabel brought with her many of Henry's paintings and his journal. Isabel Baines lived with her Aunt Catherine, Thomas Baines' widow, in Toronto, but soon she met a young farmer, Alexander Mitchell, from Erindale in Peel County. They were married in 1876. And on their honeymoon, they visited Quebec City, where they met with the Sisters of St. Augustine, and they visited Henry's gravesite. Isabel and Alexander had 5 children. The oldest child, Kate, inherited her Uncle Henry's journal and several of his paintings. Kate married Dr. David Boddington, and it was 2 of their sons, George and Arthur Boddington, who donated the journal and many of the paintings to the Library and Archives Canada in 1995. Now, I stumbled across the journal in 2013. That was while I was doing research for my book on lighthouses, this book here, For Want of a Lighthouse. And I found this funny little 19th century sketch showing the Scotch Bonnet Island Lighthouse. We saw this earlier. And that led me to find Henry's journal, The Cruise of the Breeze. I knew that this journal really needed to be brought to the attention of the wider public. So I eventually published an annotated version of Henry's journal. If you'd like to know more about Henry Baines and his journal and see much more of his artwork, my book is available online. It can be ordered from local bookstores. I have a few copies here for anyone who's interested. The Cruise of the Breeze is really a treasure trove of many, many Ontario family names. Any one of these names might provide interesting and fascinating research possibilities for genealogists. Henry's tragic death likely meant that his artwork and his journal were carefully preserved and kept safe by his family. Fortuitously, his sister later came to Canada to live, bringing with her this literary and artistic treasure. Today, it's people like Isabel's great-granddaughter, Barbara Boddington Selkirk, and Thomas Baines' 3rd great-grandson, Robert Baines, as well as other members of the Boddington and Baines families who are keeping alive the memory of Henry Edward Baines. Thank you very much.